Hello and welcome. I'm Glenn Torres-Spelliscy, your professor, and this is the International Issues Lecture Series. Thanks for joining me. The story of trade is the story of modern development. It is essentially a story about changing perspectives and values. Over time, it is about changes in understandings regarding the importance of trade to the national economies of the world. Trade is indeed the backbone of international business, and as a result, it is hard to imagine a world without it. Trade plays such a central, though often unacknowledged, role in our lives. It's everywhere around you. Most of the things that you possess, including their component parts, are manufactured in various countries around the globe. You own them solely because of trade. That is not to say that the practice of trade, international trade in particular, is without controversy. Because trade is about maximizing the market's efficiency, it can effectively destroy certain domestic industries and send them somewhere else. We only have to look at the modern U.S. manufacturing sector to get a sense of the effects of trade. There are real questions about whether the U.S. economy is still well situated to be a mass production society. The churning out of simple consumer goods can simply be done much more cost effectively in other places around the world. The U.S. does, however, maintain a competitive advantage with respect to many other industries, including the production of complex goods and complex technology, and financial services, among others. Indeed, the trade and services is the only area that the U.S. has a trade surplus in. Although trade can admittedly have some negative effects, most modern theorists and governments now view regulated trade through a positive lens. But it wasn't always this way. During the Great Depression, many of the world's leading economies adopted protectionist policies, implementing thousands of tariffs on imported goods in a misguided bid to protect domestic industry. But that belief plunged the entire world economy into recession. The belief in the benefits of trade liberalization grew in the years following the Great Depression, as President Roosevelt's policies included lifting tariffs, lifted the American economy out of depression, and ended the destabilizing trade war. In the post-war world, there was a growing recognition among leading economies that trade could be beneficial to domestic markets. That by opening up markets, a state could benefit from the competitive advantages that it had, whether that was labor, resources, capital, etc. So, following the conclusion of World War II, the international community embarked on an aggressive policy of trade liberalization. But as we learned in the Great Depression, as you open up markets, you need to build corresponding regulatory systems. While unregulated markets can be profitable, they are extremely risky. Without oversight, transparency, and regulation, participants in the market do not have reliable expectations as to how trading partners are likely to perform. That instability stands in the way of development, so the international community sought to create a regime that would allow trading partners to know what to expect when they entered foreign markets. This led to the creation of the modern international trade regime, headlined by GATT and the WTO agreements. However, beginning about 15 years ago, such large multilateral agreements began to receive some pushback, particularly from populations in developed countries that blamed the agreements for the loss of manufacturing jobs. The protests got so bad in 1999 in Seattle that the WTO meetings were essentially postponed until 2001 in Doha, Qatar, an authoritarian state where protests were less likely. Then, after the Great Recession rocked the world's economies, the Doha round of talks ended in failure in 2008. In the aftermath, countries sought to establish bilateral, regional, and free trade agreements, rather than multilateral agreements with the whole globe. We see this trend evident in both US policy and European policy, as well as the policies of developing nations like India and China. You see, on the one hand, smaller negotiations can produce more flexibility in the negotiations. But on the other, they can also create exclusionary trading blocs that benefit a privileged few, while placing downward pressure on the economies of others. National economic regulations are some of the most complicated of all types of regulation. Over time, different sectors have received differing levels of protection in different markets. Finding a way to harmonize such regulations is extremely tricky. As such, one of the big questions facing the United States with respect to trade is how far should we go in the negotiations to ensure that minimum labor and environmental standards, recognized by law in the United States, are included in our trade deals. The election of President Donald Trump in 2017 signaled a titanic shift in U.S. trade policy. Where President Obama saw an international trading system whose rules still benefited the United States, President Trump saw a system which sought to take advantage of the United States' vast consumer market, coupled with a global market that was closed to U.S. exports, with the result being a ballooning and persistent trade deficit. Now, I do think it is important to note that most economists don't necessarily believe that a trade deficit is a bad thing, particularly conservative economists. In fact, historically, trade deficits have correlated favorably with a growing economy. As Daniel Eichenson of the conservative think tank the Cato Institute explained in 2018, quote, "Trade deficits are pro-cyclical and have nothing to do with trade policy. Imports rise when the economy grows. When the economy grows, and it has been growing relatively strongly this past year, households, businesses, and governments consume more. They purchase more and domestic and imported goods and services. Stronger growth tends towards large trade deficits." Close quote. Put simply, imports rise when Americans have more money to spend. Having more money to spend is usually a sign of a growing economy. So, while it is not clear that trade deficits present a significant problem in the minds of economists, the Trump administration identified it as an issue, and you have to understand the Trump trade policy in that light, as an attempt to rebalance the trade deficit. You can do this in two ways. You can import less, or you can export more. Unless there is another recession, imports are not likely to decline. So the Trump administration set its sights on exporting more goods. President Trump focused his attention on what he believed were barriers to trade that were closing off global markets to U.S. goods. Indeed, at the G7 meeting in June 2018, President Trump proposed the elimination of all barriers to trade.
We have to, ultimately, that's what you want. You want a tariff-free, you want no barriers, and you want no subsidies, because you have some cases where countries are subsidizing industries, and that's not fair. So you go tariff-free, you go barrier-free, you go subsidy-free.
President Trump sought to force a reorganization of the system and a renegotiation of the barriers by imposing tariffs on imports to the U.S., both from traditional U.S. allies, like Europe and Canada and Mexico, as well as, most importantly, on numerous goods from China. In the lecture, I lay out a detailed timeline of the trade war between the two countries. The United States has been able to renegotiate treaties like NAFTA, which has become the USMCA, as well as come to some preliminary deals with Europe. President Biden, after he defeated President Trump in the 2020 election, did eliminate the tariffs on America's traditional allies, including coming to a deal with the EU on aluminum and steel tariffs. But he has sought to enforce the Phase 1 trade agreement that was negotiated by the Trump administration with China. It should be noted that China did not live up to its end of the bargain with respect to the trade deal, and it will be left to the Biden administration to attempt to enforce it. Attempts at a further trade deal, though, with China have sputtered, and many of the tariffs remain locked in place. In the meantime, the WTO has determined that both the original U.S. tariffs and the tariffs imposed by China in retaliation were prohibited under the WTO agreement. Both sides have appealed those rulings. Well, that's it for this week's introductory podcast. Go on to read the lecture book and the readings, and I will see you on the discussion boards.